Pokrovsk direction, here is the spokesperson of the 7th Rapid Response Corps. The air assault forces reported that the defense forces are currently trying to expand the logistical corridors in this direction as much as possible. He also stated in one of his interviews on central Ukrainian TV channels that the Russian occupiers are currently present in this direction. In fact, they are suffering absolutely staggering losses. According to your information, what is really going on with their losses right now? They're in the Pokrovsk direction. And in fact, what is the overall situation there?
Most of the numbers you mentioned, 1,180, are specifically for the Pokrovsk direction. And everything is proportional. That's how it's been throughout the entire time of this full-scale invasion, this full-scale war. If the number of assault troops, of attackers, increases, then the number of eliminated occupiers increases proportionally. What is actually happening? The enemy is trying to bypass Pokrovsk. The enemy is trying to close the encirclement as they plan. The enemy is constantly launching information psychological operations, claiming that everyone is already surrounded, there's no way out, everyone is dying, and so on. And they do this. And supposedly, by launching these information psychological operations, even within central Ukraine, they try to make it look like it's coming from our own people, as if someone from our side is telling all this. The situation is difficult, it really is tough, it's tense, but this is war, and that needs to be understood. And just like that, sometimes people reproach us saying that someone somewhere, unfortunately, has been wounded among their loved ones or, God forbid, has died. Yes, well, accidentally, this is war. We have no other choice. The life of our country, the future of our country, the very existence of the entire state is now at stake. And that's why we will do everything and anything to prevent the enemy from achieving these insane, delusional goals. Goals that, in my opinion, will not benefit them in any way, because seizing someone else's territory, violence, at all times this has been a wrongful act. Even though there is a saying that victors are not judged, they are judged, maybe not right away, but after some time. As of today, I'll say this, a very large list is being carried out. Units are carrying out tasks in specific locations, implementing countermeasures to clear certain areas, including for the logistical support of our units that are directly on the ground, fulfilling their missions. And of course, to inflict the greatest possible damage on the enemy. In principle, we are coping with the task, but I'll repeat, the situation is quite difficult. We are doing our job. That's us, that's the units of the armed forces of Ukraine and other defense forces who are taking part in this.
Let's talk a bit more about the fact that Russia has deployed the largest grouping of troops since the start of the full-scale aggression. This was stated in an interview with Sky News by the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Alexander Syrsky. According to him, more than 700,000 Russian soldiers are fighting against the Ukrainian army. Their presence stretches along the entire front line, which is over 1,200 kilometers long. And the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine also noted that despite the size of their personnel, Russian troops have not been reduced by significant losses. At the same time, in parallel, as they say, news from the swamps, Solovyov had a meltdown and he said that the war in Ukraine has already lasted almost as long as the Great Patriotic War, and there are no results. He complains that Russia is not fighting with the entire nation, and he asks Putin to bring back Stalinist methods of coercion to drive more people to the front. Let's talk about just how great the losses of the Russian Federation's army, the occupiers, really are. And are there any signs that the Kremlin will announce mobilization and try to throw more cannon fodder into the war in Ukraine?
This cannot be ruled out, and in fact, we must not rule out the possibility that they might take advantage of these things with their old grandfatherly slogans. But we know history well. Almost none of the Red Army soldiers actually went on the attack for Stalin. No one shouted. Moreover, especially the regular army, in 1941, those who had already been drafted had gone through the Finnish campaign, the occupation, or rather the attempted occupation, the invasion of Poland, and so on. They actually surrendered to the Germans in the first days of the war without a fight. There were millions, several million people, along with their equipment and with all their weapons and so on. And they know this too, the Russian analysts. All these archives are located precisely in Russia, for the most part. And they understand perfectly well that this will work against them. Otherwise, if it were possible, Putin probably would have done it a year or two ago. For now, they resort to deceiving and recruiting mercenaries from other countries. They promise them the world, huge payouts, citizenship, and so on. And this, among other things, is what sustains the numbers of this group. But there are more of them than us. That's important to understand. They trap their own people, get them into debt, or embroil them in criminal cases in order to later have leverage over them and set conditions. They say, join the army, we'll wipe your slate clean, and you'll be a hero. The special military operation and so on. But in reality, we see that Russia is already sinking. They don't have the money to pay out the bonuses and promised payments they announced before a serviceman enlists. At this moment, the most important thing for us is not to give in to this propaganda, not to be afraid of them. And basically, that's the skill, thank you. And the essential skills we already possess today, plus the crucial incoming weapons and vital military aid coming from abroad, as well as those powerful armaments we've diligently learned to produce and effectively use ourselves, are consistently yielding positive and significant results, and will undoubtedly bring even more substantial benefits in the foreseeable future. This is comprehensive work, the coordinated efforts of diplomats, the joint work of friendly countries at the political level, and in parallel, support. With material and technical resources, and in addition, within Ukraine, the problems we are aware of today need to be solved more quickly, and everything will be fine. In any case, Putin will not win this war. He simply doesn't have what it takes. Even though he has enormous potential, a huge country, and so on, he has already lost it. He has already lost it, and everyone understands this. We just need to push a little more now.
And here's another point. Look, today, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, Syrsky, visited the units currently carrying out missions in the North Slobozhansky and Kursk directions. He reported this on Telegram and emphasized that he provided everything necessary. He gave the necessary instructions to supply the units with all-terrain vehicles and additional strike assets for attacks on areas where Russian occupiers are concentrated. Let's listen to the direct speech and discuss the details.
The enemy is trying to put pressure on our troops' positions with constant assault actions. Despite this, the situation in the north of Sumy region remains stable. Ukrainian soldiers are confidently holding their positions, inflicting significant losses on the enemy in manpower and equipment, and reducing their combat potential. Alexander Syrsky, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, on Telegram. And
now, since we've already talked about Russian human resources, let's discuss their resources when it comes to equipment. What about the occupiers? How are they doing in that regard? If lately they've been using more and more armored vehicles during their attacks on Ukrainian positions, what should we expect as we move into an even colder period of the year? What do you think?
They're having problems with their equipment. Why? Because the majority of it has already been destroyed and can't be restored. But they're trying to repair on the go and put back into service using, well, again, equipment these days doesn't last long on the battlefield. With the development of various types of drone systems, equipment today just doesn't have the same impact as it did during World War II. That's something we need to understand clearly, and already, basically everyone understands this. Both on our side, on the side of our Western partners, and on the side of Russia itself, for that matter. Artillery remains active on the battlefield, and they have plenty of it, including the fact that they can produce ammunition. Their satellites help them, including Korea, which isn't all that effective. These shells are also flying, landing somewhere, exploding somewhere. But the intensive use, especially now because Putin is trying to bypass seas, occupy at a rapid pace, or maybe not so rapid anymore, Donetsk and Luhansk regions. This shows that these systems also experience wear and tear. And it's significant. There is a certain number of shots after which it needs to be upgraded, put in order, and there will be nothing to replace it with, especially since we're also helping in this regard by destroying their artillery systems. So, realistically, what they can count on, this is their advantage. Today, it's aerial bombs plus infantry. There are a lot of them, and they don't spare their troops. But we've also learned how to deal with this, and despite all the difficulties and such a huge grouping, as you correctly said, about 700,000. We take them out in droves, 1,000 more than 1,000 every day. But I think the number is much higher because there are places where we simply can't really, in fact, we can't count them there. And all of this keeps multiplying. Plus, let me repeat, operations deep behind enemy lines, including in the temporarily occupied territory of Crimea, which constantly, something explodes, something gets destroyed, and so on. Hospitals, civilian hospitals, are overcrowded in Crimea as well. Putin is striving. Putin wants a trump card. Putin wants dividends in order to bargain, to blackmail the world, and so on. But today we are doing our job. Today we are doing everything so that his words are shattered by the facts that we have.
Sergei, here's something else I'd like to discuss with you. On the night of December 6th, units of the Ukrainian Defense Forces struck military targets in the Ryazan region of the Russian Federation and in the temporarily occupied territory of the Luhansk region. This was also confirmed by the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. They clarified that the following were hit: the infrastructure of the Ryazan oil refinery, as well as the Alkevsk metallurgical plant, where Russian occupiers manufacture shell casings for the Russian military. And at the same time, this kind of information, this kind of observation is emerging. I would like to ask you whether you agree with this statement that the Russian Federation will not be able to finance the war in 2 to 3 months. If the armed forces of Ukraine continue to strike tankers and oil refineries with the same consistency and approach as they are doing now, 2 to 3 months, both the money and the resources could run out. Putin's, do you agree with that?
I agree 100%. Maybe it's not 2 to 3 months, maybe it's 1.5 to 2, maybe it's 3 to 4. But roughly speaking, those timeframes are realistic because what we see and hear from various sources, including from the funding of those very prisoners of war who tell us about how they are paid, with what delays, and sometimes they simply aren't paid at all. There are already such cases. There are cases where the promised monetary allowance isn't paid. They promise one thing, but in reality, it's something else. And this whole chain in the age of scientific and technological progress, the age of the entire country's telephonization, Putin missed the moment. He shouldn't have given citizens mobile phones so they couldn't communicate with each other. But the information still gets through anyway. And all of this negatively affects the moral and psychological state, and their army as well. Even though there are a lot of, let's say, racist nationalists there, you could even call them Nazis, judging by how they behave. Everything is fine. All of this together as a whole will have an effect. I never talk about any of our shortcomings on air, simply because, roughly speaking, I have the opportunity, let's say, with what I know and can do, to influence things, to report them somewhere so that they can be fixed. To various authorities at different levels. And the enemy doesn't need to know about this. These are our problems, and we will handle them ourselves within our own country. But as for the fact that they are wrong, that needs to be reminded to them every day using whatever means we have from all sides. Remind them, and let us recall that when the peak of mastery began during the invasion, and when the Ukrainian people, everyone took to the streets, people were being handed rifles in Kyiv, in Kharkiv, and elsewhere. There were lines. Yes, there were lines. Then the enemy started working from within the country. They began to divide, to destabilize, using all sorts of methods, saying that everything here is terrible, that everyone has been betrayed, that there's corruption everywhere, and so on. Let them sort out their own problems. We'll handle ours without them.
Absolutely.
Agree. We have enough sense. That's the